Hi, my name is Matthew Alexander. I'm a developer on the UrbanCode Deploy middleware configuration team. And in this video, I'm going to cover several different topics. I'm going to start off by giving an overview of what UrbanCode Deploy is and how it's used, just in case you're unfamiliar with UrbanCode Deploy itself. Next, I'm going to talk about how UrbanCode Deploy is used today to manage your WebSphere application and configuration deployments. After that, I'll talk about a use case where a client of ours successfully used UrbanCode Deploy to migrate their applications and configuration data from one version of WebSphere to another. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about why you may want to use UrbanCode Deploy as opposed to some of the WebSphere tools to perform a migration across WebSphere versions. And lastly, we'll go through a quick demo where we will migrate an application server from one version of WebSphere to another. So let's start by talking about UrbanCode Deploy itself. UrbanCode Deploy is an application deployment automation tool. So if you look at the image on your screen, it represents the software development lifecycle. UrbanCode Deploy really comes into play after a build is created. It helps manage the deployment of that build onto your different environments and promotion across those environments. So UrbanCode Deploy can take a build and deploy it out to your test environment. When the testing is completed, it can promote that application to your staging environment, and when it's ready for production, it can then promote it to the production environment. And UrbanCode Deploy contains features such as audit trails, so you can know who deployed what, when, and where. Versioning, so that what's deployed in your test environment could be different from what's in your production environment. And approvals needed to move your application from one environment to another. And we'll talk more about the features of UrbanCode in these next few slides. First of all, UrbanCode Deploy uses multi-tier application models. And so if you think about your application, it can be made up of different components. For example, the image on the left shows that we have an application that has three different components to it. First of all is the business logic that describes how the application is used. Next is data storage, so think of it as a database where you're going to store your data, and then a web server to serve up that business logic. So with UrbanCode Deploy, we have applications and we break them down into these different components. And the neat thing about UrbanCode Deploy is these components can be managed independently of each other, and these components can be versioned. So let's say we have version 1.0 of our business logic deployed on our machine, version 2.0 of our data storage deployed on a machine, and version 1.0 of our web server deployed on a machine. If we wanted to make a change to our business logic, we just up its version number after our change is made and deploy it out to our environment without touching the other components. UrbanCode Deploy also includes a process designer, and this is where you're going to describe how you want your applications deployed to your environments. It's easy to use. You have drag and drop steps to build these processes, and you just link them together with arrows. You can have conditional statements, like in this example, you see we have a step that says check if a component exists. If it does exist, go down this path. If it doesn't exist, go down this path. And so that allows you to easily design your processes in UrbanCode Deploy. UrbanCode Deploy also includes a feature called Blueprint Designer. And this is really used to model your infrastructure. So you can do things like provision cloud environments and deploy your applications and your components to those environments. This used to be a standalone product, but it's now included as part of UrbanCode Deploy. UrbanCode Deploy also includes nice inventory tracking, so you can look at the UI and know exactly what version of your applications and your components have been deployed into what environments. As I mentioned earlier, another feature of UrbanCode Deploy is approvals and quality gates, and this allows you to prevent users from deploying applications before certain criteria are met. So you could say, do not deploy this application to production until certain testing has been completed. The final UrbanCode Deploy feature I wanted to mention is our plugins and integrations. These plugins are really what allows UrbanCode Deploy to work well with other pieces of software. Now, the last time I checked our website, we had something like 185 plugins available for UrbanCode Deploy. So if there's something you want UrbanCode to do, or a piece of software you want UrbanCode Deploy to work well with, check out our website and see if there's a plugin available. Now, neat thing about plugins is you're able to build your own plugin to suit your own needs if there's something that you want UrbanCode to do that's not available through a provided plugin. Documentation is provided which describes how to build a plugin. You're also able to download any of our provided plugins, unzip the code, and check it out. So if you want to tweak an existing plugin or perhaps use it as an example as you build your own plugin, you're encouraged to do so. We also have community plugins on our website where UrbanCode Deploy users have built their own plugins and shared those with the UrbanCode Deploy community. So if you build a plugin and you think it could be useful for other UrbanCode Deploy users, you're encouraged to share them. So we've talked about UrbanCode Deploy itself for a bit. Now let's talk about how you can use UrbanCode Deploy with WebSphere Application Server. We'll do that by going over 3 of the WebSphere related plugins provided by IBM. The first plugin I'll mention is our WAS install plugin. This is a plugin that aids in installing WebSphere itself. It has a dependency on the IBM Installation Manager plugin, so it uses IBM Installation Manager to actually perform the WebSphere installation. This plugin also includes an example application which shows a standard WAS-ND installation. So you can use that as an example as you build a process to install WebSphere as you see fit. The second plugin we'll talk about is the WAS Configure plugin, and we're going to talk a lot more about this later in this video, but this is what really manages your WebSphere configurations. It manages your configuration data as code, which allows you to version it and do compares, and it allows you to deploy your configurations across multiple environments. And finally, I'll talk about the WAS Deploy plugin. This plugin includes steps which help with the deploying of your application files, so deploying IR files can be done using this plugin. It also includes some steps that perform administrative tasks. The things like starting a server and syncing nodes can be done using steps provided by this plugin. So with these 3 plugins, they really work in concert to provide continuous delivery. The WAS install plugin sets up your WAS environment, the WAS configure plugin lays down your configuration, and then the deploy plugin actually deploys the applications to the environments. Next, we'll take a closer look at the WAS configure plugin and how it works. Today's users face a lot of challenges when managing their WAS configurations. One example of that is the lack of history of configuration changes. So if you have an environment and you want to see what changes were made over the last month, out of the box there's not a real easy way to do that. Likewise, if you have multiple WAS environments, it's difficult to compare configurations across those environments. So if you want to see what the difference is between your dev environment and your production environment, it's usually a manual process to do so. Even if you have automated deployments, there still may be some manual resources needed to update your configuration. And to solve some of these problems, users have built libraries of WSAdmin scripts or some homegrown tools to help manage their configurations, but it gets complex and difficult to manage. The WAS Configure plugin for UrbanCode Deploy was built to alleviate these challenges for you. Let's take a look at the high-level flow of the WAS Configure plugin. It starts off on the left here with an exemplar WAS cell. That could be considered your golden configuration or your base configuration that you want all environments to build from. The WAS Configure plugin in UrbanCode Deploy connects to that WAS cell and pulls in your configuration data. It takes that configuration data and converts it into various templates so that your configuration data isn't environment specific. With your configuration data converted to templates, it's then easy to deploy that configuration data across multiple environments. So you see number 3 in this diagram, you have your WAS configuration templates bundled with your IR and WAR files, and those can be deployed out to your different environments like your dev environment, your test environment, or your production environment. When the WAS Configure plugin in UrbanCode Deploy connects to a WAS cell and pulls in that configuration data, it saves it in JSON format, and you can see an example of it on this slide. Now if you think back to earlier in this video, we talked about in UrbanCode Deploy we structure our applications by breaking them down into smaller pieces or components. You may remember that 3-tier application we had where we had a database, business logic, and a web server. For the WAS Configure plugin, we split up the configuration data into different components based on WebSphere scope. So you could have a component in UrbanCode deploy that represents your cell configuration, a component that represents a node configuration, a component that represents server configuration, or a node that represents cluster configuration. And with these different components, they may have a component version artifact in UrbanCode deploy, which would be one of these configuration data JSON files. So you could have a cell component in UrbanCode deploy, and that component could contain a version, let's call it version 1.0, and version 1.0 could have a cell.json file, which is your configuration data in this JSON format. Once we get that configuration data from our base WAS cell, we need to take that configuration data and convert it into templates. This is usually a one-time process just to get your baseline configuration set up, and the UrbanCode deploy WAS configure plugin includes several steps to help with creating those templates. We'll go through those quickly over the next few slides. First off, the WebSphere configuration discovery step is the step that connects to your WebSphere environment and extracts that configuration data, saving it into a JSON file. The next step is the extract configuration data step. So if you run a full discovery on your cell, you'll get one configuration file back containing all of your configuration data. So all of your nodes, all of your servers, all of your cluster configuration data will be stored in one file. And this step takes that one file and splits it up into different pieces depending on the WebSphere scope. So it'll split out the cell specific configuration for each of the nodes, configuration for each of the servers, and each configuration for each of the clusters. Next, we have several different steps which templatize the configuration data, and this is where we replace environment specific values with UrbanCode deploy tokens. Tokens in UrbanCode deploy allow you to easily replace values. For example, in your configuration data, you may see your cell name all over the place, and we'll replace that with a token so that when we apply your configuration data to a different cell, we can replace that token with the desired cell's name. And this is an example of what templatized configuration data looks like. You can see highlighted in red, the cell name has been replaced with a token, the node name has been replaced with a token, and the server name has been replaced with a token. The steps we just talked about also allow users to tokenize other values. So if there are other values in your configuration data that may be environment specific, you can replace them with a token so that the configuration data may be applied to alternative environments. We talked about configuration data and how it's broken down by WebSphere scope, but we can break down that configuration data further into what we call snippets. This is helpful for a few different reasons. First of all, the configuration data file may be large and a little unwieldy to work with, so breaking it down into smaller pieces just makes it easier to work with. And secondly, if we break down the configuration data by WebSphere objects, and since we are managing our WebSphere configuration as code, that allows for access control over who may touch which pieces of the configuration. Now, for example, when you discover a cell configuration, it includes security objects, which maybe you don't want certain developers to be accessing, so you can extract the security objects from the configuration data, store it somewhere where you don't give access to the developers to touch it. Snippets could also be used to create templates for objects. So let's say you extract a JDBC provider as a snippet. You could templatize it further to make the properties of the JDBC provider into tokens, and that will allow users to easily create additional JDBC providers using that snippet as a template. So earlier we described in UrbanCode deploy how an application is made up of different components, and we talked about how for WebSphere we have different components for different WebSphere scopes being cell, node, server, and cluster. And this slide just gives a visual representation of what these components may look like. So in the upper left-hand corner, we see we have a cell component. Inside that component, we have a cell.json file, which is our configuration data for the cell. And we've split that configuration data into a few different pieces. In this example, we've extracted keystore A and keystore B as their own snippet files, so that if we need to edit key store A, we can go into that file, which is a lot smaller than the cell.json. Or if we want to easily remove key store B, we could just remove that file and it would be removed from our configuration. And we see that this cell component is at version 4.1. So let's say we did want to remove key store B, we would delete that file and save a new version, call it version 4.2, and now we can deploy that cell component out to our environment. And similarly, if we look in the lower right hand corner, we have a server B component, and this server has its server.json file, which is the base config for the server, let's say. In this case, let's say we had a JDBC provider template. We used that template to create 3 more JDBC providers, added them into this server component, made it version 7.5, so when we apply out our configuration, the server and these 3 additional JDBC providers will be applied out to that server. On this slide, we see the resource tree as it appears in UrbanCode Deploy. And we'll talk about this a little more in the demo, but it basically gives you a representation of your WAS topology. So you see we have our cells, nodes, servers, and clusters displayed in this tree, and we add our components to the resource tree under the resource which the component manages. So you look at the very bottom on this image, 3 levels up, you'll see we have a folder for server clusters that contains all of our clusters. Below that we have a cluster named Matthew Dynamic Cluster, and below that we have the component itself. So that component would contain the configuration data for that cluster. So just to recap a bit, in UrbanCode Deploy you have different components that correspond to different scopes in WebSphere, and those components are versioned, and different versions can be applied to different environments. So for example, you could have a component that represents your configuration for server A. Version 4 of that configuration could be in development, while version 3 is in your QA environment, while version 2 is in your production environment, and UrbanCode manages those deployments for you. Since we're treating our configuration data as code, and since we're versioning our configuration data, that allows us to perform comparisons. For example, let's say I have version 4 of my server configuration deployed into my production environment, and then deploy version 5, and something breaks. I want to see what the differences are between version 4 of my configuration and version 5. I can do that inside UrbanCode Deploy. We have a nice UI which shows what configuration differences were detected between versions. Now when somebody's using UrbanCode Deploy to manage their WAS configuration, we really want UrbanCode Deploy to be the system of record for their configuration. We want all changes to the configuration to be done inside UrbanCode Deploy by changing that configuration data instead of going out to the admin console to make changes. But let's say we are using UrbanCode Deploy as the system of record for WAS configuration, but in the middle of the night there's a production issue and an admin goes on and makes a configuration change just to get things working again. Now we have config drift. What UrbanCode Deploy thinks your configuration is different than what's actually deployed. We have processes you can run that compare your configuration data stored in UrbanCode Deploy with what's actually deployed in WebSphere. So this process can run and detect if there are any differences between what should be deployed according to UrbanCode and what's actually deployed on WebSphere. These processes allow you to build steps to do things like notify a user in case config drift is detected, or automatically run another apply of your configuration data to overwrite those changes if they're found. I hope you now have a little better understanding of UrbanCode Deploy, the WAS Configure plugin, and how they work together to manage WAS configurations. Next, I'd like to talk about a challenge one of our clients had when migrating from one version of WAS to another, and how they used UrbanCode Deploy to help them out. IBM had a client that needed to migrate from WAS version 7 to WAS version 8.5.5. However, they had a requirement where WebSphere was not to be stopped during an upgrade, and this was really a blocker and a challenge for them. They struggled for over a year to complete the migration and were still having troubles. They looked into UrbanCode Deploy and saw how we managed WAS configurations and tried to use it to migrate their applications and configuration from one version of WAS to another. The next few slides describe the approach the client took to perform a migration using UrbanCode Deploy. First of all, you may remember that the WasConfigure plugin does a discovery of your configuration and stores that information into a single JSON file. And that means things like resource adapters and certificates or other files aren't collected by the WasConfigure plugin. So the client had to manually migrate these files over from one environment to another. Now they could have built processes in UrbanCode Deploy to do that, but the client in this case chose to do that manually. Next, they ran what we call a topology discovery process in UrbanCode Deploy against their source WAS7 machine. This just creates the topology inside the resource tree like we talked about earlier, and we'll show that when we go through the demo. Next, they ran processes to discover configuration data from their source WAS7 machine, turn it into templates, and create components which stored those templates as component version artifacts. The nice thing about this is that we have sample processes on our website that you can download and use, and that's exactly what this client did. Next, they did a topology discovery on their target WAS855 environment and added these components to the resource tree to describe their desired topology. Next, they created an application environment in UrbanCode Deploy to tie everything together, and we'll show that in the demonstration. And finally, they deployed their configuration. Now the client had 86 dynamic clusters spread over 7 nodes and had struggled for over a year to complete this migration and were unable to do so until they used UrbanCode Deploy. The end result was they were successful taking this migration approach. As a next step, they then proceeded to migrate their applications from WAS7 to WAS855. And the neat thing about this exercise was that the customer was totally new to UrbanCode Deploy and how we manage WebSphere configurations. After they went through this exercise and saw how we managed WebSphere configuration, they decided to go forward with using UrbanCode Deploy to manage their configurations. They're going to start by using UrbanCode Deploy as their disaster recovery solution. So they're going to periodically run one of these discovery processes where we collect their configuration information, save it, and version it, so that if something goes wrong in the future, they can easily roll back by applying an older version of their configuration data out. And they want to take this further and totally disable the admin console, forcing UrbanCode Deploy to be the true system of record for managing their WAS configurations. There are a few considerations you should keep in mind if using UrbanCode Deploy to perform a WAS migration. Like I mentioned earlier, the WasConfigure plugin collects your configuration data and stores it in a JSON file, but it doesn't touch or move any files that may be required to perform a migration. So things like resource adapter files or certificates must be moved from one environment to another, either manually or by building processes in UrbanCode Deploy. One issue this client faced was that things like file system paths are stored in the configuration data, and those could change between environments. For example, Java could be installed in one directory on your WAS7 machine, and on your WAS855 machine, it could be installed in a different directory. So the configuration data had to be updated in those cases. Now the good news is that our templatized steps include a field that basically do a find and replace in your configuration data, so they could update the configuration data without having to open up a text editor and manually edit JSON files. You may still be wondering, why use UrbanCode Deploy to migrate WAS versions when WebSphere itself provides migration tools? As we mentioned in the example the client faced, they had a requirement where they could not shut down WAS during a migration. And with UrbanCode Deploy, you do not need to shut down WAS to perform a migration. I believe with WAS9 migration tools, there is a clone option, which doesn't require you to shut down WebSphere itself. But if you're migrating to something like WAS version 855, UrbanCode Deploy is probably your best option to perform a migration without shutting down WAS itself. I believe with the WAS tools, you migrate an entire profile at a time. With UrbanCode Deploy, you can do more of a piecemeal migration, and that's what the client in our example did. They would migrate one cluster at a time, verify it was working, and then migrate another cluster. So if you want to migrate something like one server at a time, just as you do maybe a stage migration, you could use UrbanCode Deploy to do that. You could also perform migration in a timely manner. Now the client in our example, they migrated 7 nodes with 86 dynamic clusters total, and it took them about 12 hours, which may sound like a lot, but after struggling for a year to complete the migration, they thought that was pretty quick. Another reason you may want to use UrbanCode Deploy to perform a migration is that once you do, you're all set up to continue using UrbanCode Deploy to manage your configurations in a DevOps scenario. And finally, even if you don't use UrbanCode Deploy to perform a migration, you may want to do this discovery process before you use the WAS tools to perform a migration, collect your configuration data, then perform the migration, collect the configuration data again, and use our compare feature in UrbanCode Deploy to see how your configuration changed as part of the upgrade. And that may be useful in case you run into any issues during the upgrade. This slide comes from the WAS migration documentation itself and shows their suggested overall approach for performing a WAS migration. The first step is this migration strategy and discovery. In this step, you fill out basically a questionnaire describing your WAS environment, features you'd like to see going forward, and it suggests a best approach on how you should migrate WAS versions. Next, there's this binary analysis step. This is where things like your EAR files or WAR files are analyzed and suggestions are made for changes you may need to incorporate when moving from one version of WAS to another. Next is a similar step, it's source migration. This is where things like Java files or XML files are analyzed and changes are suggested depending on which version of WAS you're migrating to. And the final step is config migration, and this is where UrbanCode Deploy really fits in. We can take your configuration and perform that migration for you instead of using the WAS tools. We've talked about using UrbanCode Deploy to migrate WAS versions, but it could also be used to migrate from on-prem WAS to WAS in the cloud. We call that lift and shift to the cloud, and the migration approach is really similar. You capture your configuration data on your traditional WAS environment, install WAS on the cloud, and then simply apply that configuration data out to the cloud. So if you're interested in moving to WAS in the cloud, UrbanCode Deploy is a great fit for performing that migration. Now let's take a break from the slides and we'll actually perform a migration where we'll take a server from WAS 855 and migrate it to WAS 9. Let's start by looking at my WebSphere 855 environment. I have a WebSphere application server named Source 855 server. That's the one I'm interested in moving to WAS 9. I added a WebSphere variable to that server named createdInVersion with the value WAS 855, and I just did that so we'll have something to look for once we migrate that server, make sure that value was carried over. In my WAS 9.0 environment, if I look at my servers, I should have nothing listed. The first thing we need to do in UrbanCode Deploy is to discover the topology of our WAS 855 machine. So to do that, I'm going to go to the Resources tab and create a new top-level group. Next, I'll add my agent, which is on my WAS 855 machine, to this group. Now, a process is going to run automatically, which will detect if WebSphere isn't installed on the same machine as the agent. So I'll click this refresh button, and we should see a twisty appear here. And we expand this, we'll see we have a WebSphere cell resource in our resource tree. Next, I'm going to edit the properties of this WebSphere cell to enter my credentials and make sure it can connect to WebSphere using WSAdmin. Name is a required field, but we're going to pull the real name of the cell from the cell itself when we perform the topology discovery, so I can enter any value in here. Next, I'll enter my WAS user credentials, and I'm running on a different port than the default. So I will save them. The next step is to run this configure using WebSphere topology discovery. When this process completes, we can close this dialog and refresh our resource tree. And we'll see that we discovered things like nodes and any servers that are on the machine, including our source 855 server. Next, I'm going to go to Processes, and I'm going to run a process which I downloaded from our plugin website. This is an example that anybody can use, and it's going to perform a discovery where it collects that configuration information, turns it into templates, and then creates a component in UrbanCode deploy and associates that JSON file, that configuration data, with the component. So when I pick a resource to run against, I'm going to select that source 855 server and hit submit. And this process is going to run this configuration discovery step where it collects that configuration information. Then it's going to turn it into templates by taking things like the cell name out, the server name out, and replacing it with tokens so that we can apply it to any environment. And then this get info step is just going to get a date timestamp so that I can create a component version. First I'm going to create a component if it doesn't exist already. I already run this before, so it does exist. And then we're going to create a new version. I'm using that date stamp just to ensure that my version has a unique name. So I'm going to speed up this video a bit and let this process run. Okay, the process completed. It took 1 minute and 18 seconds. And the end result should be a component. I'll go to my components. And I have a component named server-source855 server. If I look at this component closely and look at versions of my component, I'll see a new version was created. If I look at that version, there's an artifact, which is my server.json file. I'm going to download it and open it up just so you can see what the file looks like. So I've collected configuration data from my 855 server, and now I want to apply it out to my WAS9 environment. So to do that, I'm going to start by running a topology discovery on my WAS9 environment. I'm just running the same steps I did to run a topology discovery on my 855 environment. So I've entered my credentials, and now I can run the topology discovery on my WAS9 environment. That process completed, so I can close this dialog, refresh my resource tree. We see that the cell name was updated, and I have a couple nodes here, dmanager node. If I go to servers, I see my node agent, but I want to add my server from WAS855. So to do that, I need to add a resource that represents my WAS server. I'll do that by going to Show Resource Roles and searching for WebSphere server. Then I can click and drag this over and place it under the servers folder. So I'm going to create this WebSphere server, and I had this server named source855 server in my source855 environment, but since I've replaced that value with a token, I can rename it to anything else. It'll still have the same configuration, just a different name. So I'm going to name my server Hi YouTube, and we see it shows up in the resource tree now. Now I have that component which represents the configuration. I need to associate it with this resource. So to do that, I add a component to this resource. I click the Save button to add the component to the resource. Now it's placed underneath the resource that it's going to manage. So I have my resource tree set up. The next thing I need to do is create an application in UrbanCode Deploy. And I need to create environments for my application. So I'm going to set up an environment that represents my WAS9 environment. When I click on the environment, I need to add a base resource, and this just goes out to the resource tree. I'm going to click that WAS9 folder, which represents my WAS9 environment. If I go back to my application itself, I can now add components for my application by clicking on this Components tab. And I'll add that server source 855 server component. This component contains a process which actually does the applying. So I can go ahead and run that process, and it should create my server in WAS9. And what this process is doing is it's deleting files and directory that are in a working directory for the agent, which is sitting on the WAS9 machine. It's going to download artifacts, so it's downloading that server.json file to the agent machine. It's replacing tokens, so the tokens in the configuration data are being replaced with the correct cell name and server name and node name. This step combines any JSON files that we have in that directory. In this case, we just have the one server.json, but if we had snippets representing other objects, they'd all be merged into one file, and then finally they're going to be applied out to our environment. Let's speed up the video a bit. Okay, the process completed. It took 1 minute and 20 seconds. Now let's go out to our WAS9 environment and see if our server was created. See, our server was created. It's named Hi YouTube as I specified in the resource tree. Let's just make sure that that WebSphere variable was carried over from our WAS855 environment. Yep, we see that the created in version variable has been carried over from WAS855. So now we've successfully migrated a server from WAS855 to WAS9. Let's wrap up this video by sharing some helpful links where you can find more information about UrbanCode Deploy and the WAS plugins. Here are links to the 3 plugins we talked about in this video: the WAS Install plugin, the WAS Configure plugin, and the WAS Deploy plugin. For the WAS Configure plugin, here's a link to migration documentation that walks you through the process we just did to complete a WAS migration. There's also a link to the example processes, including the one we used in this demo. Here's a link to a webinar where we discuss WAS Configure at a high level. And the usage page contains lots of documentation, blog entries, and videos related to the WAS Configure plugin. Finally, here's a link where you can learn more about UrbanCode itself, and the UrbanCode page includes a microsite discussing how UrbanCode Deploy works with WebSphere. That's it for this video. I just want to thank you for watching.